Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Right. Well, good afternoon. We're going to give it a couple minutes before we get started so that everybody can join us. It's really nice to see so many people getting on. It's awesome. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to officially welcome you to the 5th annual Philip R. Nader Legacy of Health Lectureship. My name is Alexander Vandenberg, and I'm the Associate Director at the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living. I'm also Professor of Health Promotion and Behavioral Sciences at the UT School of Public Health in Austin. Today's lectureship is hosted by the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living at the UT Health School of Public Health in Austin. And the center's mission is healthy children in a healthy world. And before we get started, I just want to make some housekeeping announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived along with the presentation slides on our website at msdcenter.org. And if you have any questions during the presentations, we're going to ask you to hold those questions, but go ahead and enter them into your questions chat box. Then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And then before we get started, I'd like to make one more announcement. The Dell Center houses several endowments that make lectureships like today's possible. One of those endowments was established in our center is the Srila and Vibhu Sharma Endowed Fund for Excellence in Community Nutrition, Health, and Wellness. The Sharma Endowed Fund provides a stipend and project experience opportunities to work with Brighter Bites, which is a nonprofit organization that aims to improve eating behavior by providing a routine distribution of fresh produce, along with corresponding education in school and also at home. And this fellowship requires a research commitment of 2 semesters and provides the fellow with an opportunity to engage in public health research, including data analysis, manuscript writing, and publications. Our newest 2020-2021 Sharma Fellow is Fengzhu Li. And Fengzhu Li is, she obtained her master's degree in epidemiology from Tulane in 2018. And then she's currently working on her doctorate in epidemiology at the UT Health School of Public Health in Houston. She's been working, she has been appointed, or she was appointed as the Susan G. Komen Predoctoral Fellow since the fall 2020, and is currently working on studies in breast cancer disparities to investigate how social inequities and biological differences contribute to disparities in screening, treatment, and survivorship of breast cancer. We want to give a huge welcome and congratulations to Fengzhu. And I will now hand it over to Dr. Srila Sharma, who will provide some background on the Nader Lectureship series and introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you, Srila.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Kate, if we can move to the next slide. Hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this lectureship to everyone. As Dr. Vandenberg mentioned, I'm Srila Sharma. I'm a professor of epidemiology at the University of Texas School of Public Health in Houston. And I'm also a faculty member at the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living. The picture that you see in front of you is that of Dr. Phil Nader, who dedicated his career to the advancement of child health, and his contributions to our understanding of early life cycle systems cemented his legacy of health. The aim of this annual lectureship that has been generously established due to an endowment by Dr. Nader and his family is to promote and strengthen the nexus between health theory and practice in 2 ways. First, the Nader Legacy of Health Lectureship is designed to educate and inform academics, providers, public health students, and community members about early life cycle systems. Today, we are fortunate to learn from and be inspired by Dr. Jennifer Orlet Fisher from Temple University College of Public Health. Second, this event is intended to stimulate cooperation and collaboration among physician, patient, family, and community. The goal is to move toward improved health status for both parents and children, a legacy of health for generations to come. We are so thankful for Dr. Nader's leadership, and we are also very excited to have some of Dr. Nader's family members in attendance today, virtually, of course. All right, so let's move on to our keynote speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Orlet Fisher. Dr. Fisher is a professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Associate Director of the Center for Obesity Research and Education in the College of Public Health at Temple University. Dr. Fisher's research seeks to understand influences on the development of eating behaviors and weight outcomes during early childhood. Her current research is investigating sweet preferences and snacking behaviors in early childhood. I still have that problem today. Dr. Fisher has published widely in leading nutrition and obesity journals with more than 125 peer-reviewed research publications and has editorial advisory roles at Appetite, Child Development, and Obesity, Science and Practice. These are some of the high-impact journals in our field. So Dr. Fisher, with that, I'm going to hand it off to you to hear your talk on Taming Children's Sweet Tooth, a biopsychosocial approach for reducing added sugar intakes among children. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful invitation. I'm really delighted to be here today. It's an incredible honor to deliver the 2020 Philip R. Nader Legacy of Health lecture. And so I'd like to just start out by thanking the Nader family for this wonderful invitation, as well as the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about sugar and its role in obesity prevention. During graduate school, I studied with the late Dr. Leanne Birch, who's widely credited for establishing really the entire field of study around the development of children's eating behaviors. And when she began to publish her seminal studies in the 1980s, there were actually only a handful of scientists around the world who were interested in studying how children's eating behaviors develop. It wasn't until the obesity epidemic emerged and environmental contributions were recognized in the late 90s that this field of study really moved from the fringe, so to speak, into the spotlight. And the field is rapidly evolving. In this lecture, I'd like to focus on what we know about family-based prevention efforts to reduce children's intake of added sugars. Next slide, please. All right, so let's start out with where we are. These are the most recent data on the prevalence of obesity among US children. And coincidentally, if you look at the starting point of this analysis, which is 1999, it's actually a year after Hill and Peters published a seminal paper in Science, which is now cited more than, I think, 3,000 times. That was one of the first to highlight environmental contributions to obesity and actually call for prevention efforts. But despite the considerable attention that's been given to prevention since this time, we see that the prevalence has not decreased among US children and in fact has continued to rise among school age and adolescents, where obesity affects roughly 1 out of every 7 preschoolers and 1 out of every 5 school age children and adolescents in the US. Next. We know that there are significant disparities in obesity and its profound health burdens. And so if we look at the data, we see very clearly that Hispanic and Black children and those living in lower income and less educated households are disproportionately impacted. To date, our large-scale multi-level interventions aimed at minority children from low resource backgrounds have only shown limited success in reaching these underserved population, and I think this really highlights the need for more effective approaches to prevention. Next. So why is added sugar such a critical target moving forward? Next slide. We know that dietary patterns are powerful drivers of the energy imbalance that fundamentally underlies obesity. And 4 years ago, the American Heart Association published a review on added sugars and CVD risk in children that received a great deal of attention. Based on the current evidence at that time, the working group came really to the sobering conclusion that links between added sugars and CVD risk factors among children are actually present at levels far below current consumption levels, with strong evidence of effects on excessive energy intake, adiposity, and dyslipidemia. And in particular, the report pointed out a preponderance of longitudinal and RCT evidence on sugar-sweetened beverages and increased adiposity in children. Next slide. So, how much sugar are kids actually consuming? These numbers represent intakes over a decade from NHANES data from 2005 to 16. You can see that by preschool, intake among children is about 30% higher than current dietary guideline limits on added sugar, which are less than 10% of daily energy. As many of you may know, the new 2025 dietary guidelines are set to come out in December. And the scientific report of the advisory committee always precedes that. And from that report, I think we can actually expect that limits on added sugar are going to be dialed back even further. That committee determined that limits of about 6% of energy from added sugars are more consistent with a dietary pattern that meets nutrient requirements, while avoiding excess energy. So if we look at that, what I believe will be the new benchmark, we would imagine that current levels of preschool and school-age children are actually more than 2 times where they need to be. Next slide. Like obesity, we see that diet quality and intake of added sugars show disparities along socioeconomic gradients. Here among US adults participating in NHANES, you can see that intakes are lower among men and women with household incomes that are greater than 349% of the federal poverty level. And that's even after adjusting for age, race, ethnicity, and education. Next slide. So the diet quality income gradient is actually not surprising, right? Because healthful diets cost more than those that are abundant in energy but poor in nutrients. And Adam Janowski and his colleagues have done a lot of this work. These graphs show, the graph on the right, shows the cost per 100 calories of USDA food groups over a 12-year period based on a nutrient analysis of 384 foods that are part of a really widely used food frequency questionnaire. What you can see in the figure on the left is that fat and sugar are cheap relative to more nutrient-rich foods like vegetables, fruits, and meats. And importantly, close to 3/4 of the foods in that fat and sweet groups are ultra-processed. If you look at the graph on the right, you can see that ultra-processed foods are cheaper per calorie, and they're also more energy dense and nutrient poor than unprocessed foods. Next slide. We also see close links between added sugar intake and ultra-processed foods when we actually look at the consumption patterns of US children. An analysis of NHANES data from 2009 to 14, you see a strong linear association between ultra-processed food and added sugar in children's diets, where ultra-processed foods contributed to 65% of total energy intake and really a staggering 92% of energy from added sugars among US children aged 2 to 19 years of age. So to summarize, I think if you look at the evidence, it shows that added sugar intake is harmful for obesity as well as cardiometabolic health of young children. It's consumed at levels that well exceed current limits, higher among lower SES groups, cheap in the food supply, and it's concentrated in ultra-processed foods. But there are 2 additional aspects of added sugar that I think make it a potentially impactful target for prevention. Next slide. First, added sugar is only one of 2 energy-containing nutrients for which the dietary guidelines recommends limiting in the interest of preventing excessive intake. The other nutrient is saturated fat. And so we can argue about whether sugar or fat drives obesity, but from a nutritional standpoint, it's clear that fat often travels with other nutrients in foods that are important in children's diets, such as shortfall nutrients like calcium and vitamin D and dairy sources, whereas added sugar offers little value to the diet beyond calories. And second, the concentration of added sugar in a few sources make it a very specific target for prevention, and that is potentially impactful. I've had the good fortune of working with Gary Foster over the years. He's internationally known for his work on behavior change and obesity treatment and prevention. And Gary says that effective intervention rests on having a short list of specific goals. In fact, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and he said something like, you're going to have a much greater likelihood of success if the goal is eat 3 bananas than if the goal is to simply eat healthy, right? So what's important here is that the top 5 sources of added sugar intake comprise 79% of intake among adolescents. It's similar for younger children as well. And in fact, if you look at sugar-sweetened beverages and baked goods alone, this represents about 2/3 of intake of added sugars, where the top 5 sources of saturated fats only comprise 39% of total intake. And then you have to go down in the list to about the 17th food on the list till you reach about the same coverage as added sugar. So in terms of population level efforts, the goals for added sugar are limited and specific, right? They are drink fewer sugary beverages and fewer ultra-processed packaged sweets. Next slide. While there's a strong case to be made for targeting added sugars in efforts to prevent obesity and reduce health disparities, we don't need data to know that moving children's preferences from candy to carrots feels a little bit daunting, right? Next slide. So even to the casual observer, it's obvious that children need little encouragement to like sweets. And in fact, there's an extensive literature in the sensory sciences that establishes that preferences for sweet tastes are apparent from the earliest points in development, long before children actually experience the first taste of solid foods or complementary foods. So facial expressions to and intake of oral solutions demonstrate that newborns actually prefer sweet and umami tastes. They're actually indifferent to salt shortly after birth, but begin to show preferences about 4 months of age. In contrast, we know that bitter and sour tastes tend to be rejected from birth. So these predispositions, which show wide individual differences, are thought to have evolved to favor survival in environments of scarcity by encouraging intake and reinforcing seeking of energy-rich foods. And we know the current dietary environment that's replete with added sugar exploits this aspect of our biology. Next slide. So there's actually evidence that children live in a heightened sensory world where these taste predispositions are concerned. For instance, children show heightened sensitivity to some bitter tastes relative to adults. So Julie Manella has done a lot of this work, and she's demonstrated that children with bitter sensitive TAS2R38 genotypes were more sensitive to a bitter tastant or solution than adults with exactly the same genotype. And so similarly, children show heightened preferences for sweetness. Again, in Julie Manella's lab, who's here in Philadelphia at the Monell Chemical Senses Center, she and others have shown that children prefer higher concentrations of sugar as well as non-nutritive sweeteners compared to adults. Next slide. So when we look at added sugar levels in the population, it might not seem to bear out these ideas. Here we see added sugar intakes in grams per day, and you actually see that it increases with age until adolescence when intake peaks and then sort of levels off or drops a little bit into adulthood. Next slide. However, when you plot the data to take into account differences in body size, we see a very different picture. Looking at sugar intake per kilogram of body weight, we see that intake is actually highest in toddlerhood and preschool. So that means that added sugar intake during early childhood is not only higher than recommended limits, but higher per kg than at all other life stages. So in summary, children do not have to learn to like sweet, and in fact, they both prefer it and consume it at higher levels than adults. Next slide. So that doesn't sound very promising, right? But I think the glimmer of hope rests in the fact that while learning is not required for children to prefer sweet tastes, the sensation of sweetness is context dependent and can be modified through experience. So there are a number of studies described on this slide that provide evidence that exposure to sweetness during childhood may shape later preferences. The last point, which is highlighted, it refers to one of the best known studies on the effects of repeated exposure by Susan Sullivan and Leanne Birch. And in that study, they found that children who were repeatedly exposed to sweetened tofu, which was initially unfamiliar to them, preferred that version over salty and plain versions after repeated exposure. And in fact, the most interesting subtext of the findings that is actually not often discussed was that children actually learned to prefer the version of tofu to which they were repeatedly exposed. So the children who had repeated exposure to the salty version of tofu ended up preferring that salty version over the sweet version. And I think that's really profound. That means that actually familiarity trumps sweetness, right? And suggests that children's orientation to sweetness is a movable target that is shaped through associative learning and familiarization, and that occurs around the table. Next slide. So a rapidly growing literature points to the family as a critical context for shaping children's experiences and learning about eating and perhaps sweetness. This figure is a widely cited socio-ecological model of obesity among children put forth by Kirsten Davison and Leanne Birch close to 2 decades ago, which highlights dynamic interactions between individual, family, and broader socioeconomic factors in shaping children's dietary intake and weight outcomes. As a whole, this body of literature points to parents as key agents of socialization through their influences on the types of foods made available to children, through the social models of eating behavior that children learn to emulate, and in the styles and practices that parents use to feed their children. Next slide. In my own work over the past decade, we've seen that parenting around snacking may be particularly important where added sugars are concerned. So you don't need data to know this either. Snacking is nearly universal among children. In terms of frequency, the newest NHANES data from 2017 to 18 tell us that 3/4 of US children between 2 to 19 years of age consume 2 or more snacks daily. And snacks contribute significant energy to children's diets, on par with that of other meals, providing approximately 1/4 of daily energy, more for younger children. And importantly, 36% of children's intake of total sugars. And then finally, in terms of quality, we know that snacks are a portal for saturated fats and added sugars into children's diets. Graph on the right comes from an older NHANES data from a paper by Barry Popkin and colleagues, and it demonstrated that about half of the calories that children consume from snacks come from foods that are high in solid fats, which includes mostly saturated fats and added sugars. Next slide. In our research, we've seen that young children are provided snacks for numerous reasons, but a number of which are not actually related to nutrition. In this qualitative study of 59 ethnically diverse parents of preschoolers with low-income backgrounds, we used card sort methodology to understand why children are given snacks. And so in this methodology, parents are essentially given a deck of cards. And these cards were developed specifically for this study, depicting 65 different types of snacks that we identified using 24-hour recall data. And we asked parents to group those cards and then label those groups according to the purposes that they offered their children, snacks to their children. And you can see on the list on the right that only 2 of the top 5 purposes explicitly mention hunger and thirst. Other purposes included child requests, using snacks as a reward for good behavior, or as a bribe to prevent bad behavior. Next slide. When we sorted the same deck of cards by the nutrient content of those snacks, and we did this using the USDA My Pyramid Food Equivalence database, we found that snacks that parents reported giving for non-nutritive purposes contain higher levels of saturated fats and added sugars than those given for reason related to nutrition and appetite. Next slide. In a subsequent quantitative study of 271 children ranging from 2 to 12 years with low-income backgrounds, we saw that parents who reported greater use of non-nutritive reasons for offering snacks had children who were less likely to meet dietary recommendations for obesity prevention over the last month. And so these data collectively highlight that sugary foods, which we know are innately desirable to children and top snack food sources, are also socially reinforced, right? By the use of such foods as treats, rewards, and celebration in a manner that may ultimately negatively influence diet quality. Next slide. So it's clear that snacking may be a target for family-based prevention efforts around added sugar intake among children. But what do we know about parenting in terms of how it can best support efforts to lower added sugar intake among children? Next slide. So food parenting is often described in terms of styles versus practices, and drawing from the developmental sciences, many decades of developmental sciences. In fact, feeding styles reflect the broader context within which specific practices are used and are described in terms of reflecting the emotional climate around feeding. So feeding styles are typically categorized, and they're characterized using two dimensions. So demandingness, which refers to parental control and demands for maturity, as well as responsiveness, which refer to parental warmth and acceptance. Feeding practices, alternatively, are goal-directed behaviors. So an example would be pressuring children to eat vegetables. Important for prevention, practices are not actually specific to particular feeding styles, and they are thought to be more amenable to change. Though if you actually look at the evidence, I think there's limited evidence on this point. In any case, so what approaches to parenting appear to be most beneficial? Next slide. So first, the research on feeding styles. The research here shows the greatest contrast in child dietary outcomes between indulgent and authoritative styles. So indulgent styles involve low levels of demandingness as well as responsiveness. So indulgent parents make few demands on children's eating but support children's autonomy. Authoritative styles, in contrast, balance both demandingness and responsiveness, where parents are setting limits and providing structure, but also supporting children's autonomy. So cross-sectional studies, the authoritative styles are associated with higher intakes of nutrient-dense foods, lower intake of energy-dense snack foods and added sugar, as well as higher overall dietary quality compared to indulgent feeding styles. And direct observations have shown that children with authoritative parents also serve themselves smaller portion size at meals than children of indulgent parents. Next slide. One of the most rigorous observational studies to date used direct observations of 3 dinner meals in the home to evaluate diet quality of foods served to and consumed by 145 Black and Hispanic preschoolers from families with low income levels. Parents with authoritative feeding styles had children who were served and consumed meals of higher diet quality compared to other styles, suggesting that parenting styles may influence both the type of foods offered to child and the types of foods consumed by children. Next slide. When we look at associations of feeding styles with weight outcomes, the most consistent findings are around indulgent feeding styles, showing associations with higher weight status among preschool-age children, probably in about a half a dozen cross-sectional studies. This slide shows you one of the only prospective studies to date. In this analysis involving 187 Hispanic preschoolers and Head Start, parents' reports of indulgent feeding styles when children were 4 to 5 years of age were positively associated with child BMI Z-scores at age 7 to 8 years. And so the evidence on indulgent feeding styles is fairly robust. It's important to note that the associations of weight status with other types of feeding styles are not as consistent. Next slide. When we look at the research on general parenting styles, however, those that are not specific to feeding, there is fairly strong evidence of a protective effect of authoritative approaches on weight status. So this is a seminal study of 800 parent-child dyads participating in the NICHD Early Child Care and Youth Development Study. And what we saw in this study is that those children with authoritative mothers had the lowest prevalence of overweight. And in fact, if you look at the prevalence across feeding styles, you see that among the other styles, prevalence was 2 to 5 times greater. So in addition to this study, which is now somewhat dated, there are now close to probably a half a dozen prospective studies showing protective effects of general parenting styles general authoritative parenting styles on weight outcomes in children. Next slide. So lastly, what does the research say about food parenting practices? The research on food parenting practices has historically focused on highly controlling types of feeding practices that increase children's risk of poor outcomes like obesity. And we actually know much less about supportive approaches. Newer conceptual frameworks have identified the provision of structure and support for children's autonomy as two potentially important overarching dimensions. And a recent systematic review of 88 studies summarized associations with children's intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and salty snacks. So of the 9 practices that are shown on this slide, only 2 showed clear evidence of a protective effect. Both involved structure. So lower availability of sugar-sweetened beverages in the home and lower levels of parental modeling the consumption of those foods were associated with lower intakes among children. So I think it's important to point out that most of the literature on food parenting to date has been cross-sectional, and scientific understanding of supportive approaches is relatively cursory. So we have a good deal yet to learn. And further, while much of the newer research, particularly on feeding styles, involves diverse and underrepresented populations, the literature as a whole is slanted toward well-resourced and white families. And so those are important limitations. But with those things in mind, the best evidence, the available evidence that we have to date suggests that authoritative approaches to feeding, particularly the provision of structure, is associated with better dietary and weight outcomes among young children. Next slide. So what does that mean for how we intervene? The largest intervention literature on added sugar intake in children focuses on sugar-sweetened beverages, which is the top source. A 2017 review and meta-analysis of 23 interventions revealed a significant medium effect size equivalent to about a 2.5 fluid ounce reduction in daily intake versus controls. So we know we can move the needle on children's consumption of sugary foods. Importantly, home-based interventions were more effective than those in school settings, and I think this really highlights the importance of family-based prevention, certainly for young kids. However, importantly, only 1 of 9 home-based interventions address parenting, and I think herein lies a real opportunity. Next slide. We recently published findings of a food parenting intervention that I think is one of the first designed to specifically target reductions in children's intake of added sugars, as well as solid fats across the entire diet. Food, Fun, and Families, which I'll refer to as the FFF intervention because it's a mouthful, was a 12-week group-based RCT that was designed to help moms with low-income backgrounds build authoritative parenting skills for reducing their preschool-age children intake of solid fats and added sugars, which I might refer to as SOFAs. This work was done in North Philadelphia, and we primarily recruited mothers from women, infant, and children offices in North Philadelphia, close to Temple University. The intervention emphasized practices reflecting structure and autonomy support, and utilize behavioral change techniques to help mothers shift foods offered to their children, particularly at snacks, given our previous work, from woe foods, which would be sugar-sweetened beverages, desserts, to go types of foods like milk, fruits and vegetables, things lower in those nutrients. And we used a traffic light system, which is pretty standard in studies of behavioral weight control. And I'd just like to point out that Gary Foster, Elena Serrano, and Bob Whitaker were very involved in this work as co-investigators. Okay, so next slide, please. So what did we see? We saw that the FFF intervention led to reductions in solid fats and added sugar among children, and it actually increased authoritative parenting practices among mothers. So following the 12-week intervention, FFF children consumed 94 calories or 23% less daily energy intake from solid fats and added sugars than children in the control group, and that was after adjusting for baseline levels. If you look on the right graph at post-intervention, FF moms were also observed to display more authoritative practices at a buffet meal eaten with their children. So the types of practices that we observed included aspects of structure, like limiting low foods at the meal, as well as aspects of autonomy support, like encouraging children to try go foods. So these results contribute to a small intervention literature on food parenting. And I think they provide some of the first evidence of efficacy for family-based interventions targeting added sugar intake among children in under-resourced populations. Next slide. So where do we want to go from here? I wanted to end by really talking about priorities for advancing the science of family-based prevention efforts in this area. Next slide. The first priority for research is really, I think, to better align prevention efforts with parents' aspirations, as well as the challenges they face in feeding their children. We know that sugar is palatable, it's rewarding, it's socially reinforced, it's cheap, it's heavily marketed in the form of ultra-processed foods. And I think that understanding parental perspectives and contextual influences on parenting will be critical for moving the needle on added sugar, particularly in underrepresented groups and families with low resources. Next slide. In conducting formative work for our FFF food parenting intervention, we found that mothers of preschoolers with low-income backgrounds actually talked about a number of aspirations for feeding that were consistent with obesity prevention goals. Importantly, however, they talked about those aspirations through a lens that emphasized values on the parent-child relationship and on children's development. For instance, mothers talked about the value of family meals. Moms saw mealtimes as a time for building a strong and lasting emotional connection to their children. One mother said, "There's nothing to me more important than sitting down and having time with your family. So many things you have to fight out in the world that you shouldn't have to fight inside your home. I think it helps when you create a relationship, and when you create a relationship within your house, it helps you build outside of it," which I thought was an amazingly profound quote. Moms also talked about the values of limit setting. By saying no to foods that their children wanted, mothers hoped they could teach their children important life lessons about not always being able to have what you want. So one mom said, "It's not hard for me to say no because sometimes you know what's good to you is not good for you. So I'm looking out for their well-being by saying no. You might not like me now, but you'll love me later." I love that quote too. And lastly, finally, mothers talked about aspirations related to added sugar intake that were not about obesity prevention, but rather about preventing hyperactivity. And importantly, and again, this is a population with low levels of resources, about tooth decay. So this mother talked about her son and said he had to get his teeth pulled out at the age of 3. And my 2 little ones, I was like, no, I can't have that done. So that's why I don't give them candy. Okay, next slide. However, the same work also identified challenges that mothers had in limiting their children's intake of foods that were high in solid fats and added sugars. And again, snacking was a focal context. So on one hand, moms acknowledged the poor nutritional quality of some snacks when they described snacks as involving less preparation, balance, and sustenance than meals, and not being real food. So one mom said, "You heat up a meal and a snack you can just take out of the wrapper." And another mom said of her son, "He's really skinny, he doesn't like to eat. All he likes are snacks and cereal." So on the other hand, we saw that snacks were not only appealing to children, but their mothers, right? And so they had strong value to mothers in the home, but beyond the values, the hedonic values to mothers, snacks also helped mothers manage their children's behavior. Next slide. So this is a new qualitative study by Katie Loth at University of Minnesota, and I've been involved with. And this study highlights that a number of other individual and family level factors that can create those gaps between parental aspirations and or intentions and their actual behaviors. And so using semi-structured interviews, parents were asked to discuss momentary influences that altered their typical routines or the types of foods they offered. And what you see in the orange rectangle is that fatigue and stress were commonly mentioned by parents, as well as things like children's moods, family activities, and work schedule changes. And importantly, families talked about how these circumstances shifted parenting to more indulgent and coercive types of practices, such as the use of bribes and food to manage children's behavior. Next slide. Another new study highlights parental stress in particular as an important influence on children's consumption of foods that are high in saturated fat and added sugars in at-risk populations. So this is an analysis by Brittany Schuler at Temple University, and it's an analysis of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study data involving approximately 5,000 children born to unmarried mothers. And in this analysis, parent stress was a significant mediator of longitudinal associations of economic hardship and children's intake of foods that were high in saturated fat and added sugar at the age of 9 years. And if we think about the fact that there are strong biological effects of sugar on stress responses, these sort of relationships also make sense, and you might hypothesize that parent consumption of high saturated fat, added sugar types of foods may be at play here too. Next slide. So I think there are tremendous opportunities here for family-based prevention to do a better job of drawing from parental aspirations and challenges to develop interventions that are meaningful and relevant. In developing our FFF intervention, we drew from mothers' perspectives to frame the prevention goals in a way that really resonated with their lived experiences. So for example, when we spent one session talking about eating with your children, we didn't lead with the important for nutritional outcomes, but rather we talked about family meals as a way to build stronger bonds between parent and children and create happy memories at the table, which was very important for these mothers because they weren't necessarily experiences they had had in their own childhood. We also, when we talked about setting limits, we didn't lead with the research on indulgent feeding styles, but rather emphasized saying no as a loving response to help teach children life lessons. So it was really a profound kind of aha moment for me, both as a scientist and a parent, that really highlighted the critical importance of aligning interventions to meet parents where they're at. Next slide. The second priority, I think, is the need to place prevention efforts within a broader context of child development. So early child development involves the progression of perceptual, motor, cognitive, language, socio-emotional, and self-regulation skills. Maureen Black at University of Maryland and colleagues have argued that nurturing care promotes development across multiple domains, including nutrition, health, and early learning, such that when we integrate nutrition and child development interventions, that may offer synergies for prevention efforts. Next slide. So a phenomenal example of this is the Inside Obesity Prevention Trial developed by Ian Paul, Leanne Birch, and Jen Savage at Penn State. Insight was conceptualized to promote responsive parenting skills across multiple domains of sleep, feeding, emotional and social regulation, and interactive play. And I think what its brilliance is that it made contact with the main issues that concern most parents of newborns, right? How's my child eating? How are they sleeping? Is their development on track? And rather than focusing on feeding in isolation of these other critical areas, Insight created synergies between them. So, for example, promoting children's emotional regulation and helping parents learn how to soothe children involves providing alternatives to food, right? And in turn, helping children learn self-soothing techniques might help facilitate sleep and so forth. Next slide. And it worked. The proof is in the pudding, right? The trial involved 279 dyads that were assigned to either receive that intervention or a home safety control intervention that was delivered at home visits, for home visits during the first year of life. And when they looked at the data at 3 years, those children in the responsive parenting intervention had lower BMI Z-scores than those in the control group. So I think there are tremendous opportunities for new approaches to prevention that place nutrition and growth within a broader context of child development. Next slide. And I think the last need is to really directly address individual differences in children's eating behaviors. Individual differences in children's eating behaviors are actually well documented in research dating back to the 1990s. Early examples are caloric compensation and food neophobia. And these differences are thought to represent biologically influenced trait-like tendencies towards food approach and food avoidance. So imagine the child at a birthday party who's running around blowing the party horns, right? Versus the child who's fixated on the cake. That child fixated on the cake probably has higher levels of food approach tendencies and vice versa. So food approach behaviors like eating in the absence of hunger have been associated with higher body mass index and obesity. And newer evidence indicates that these individual differences may also shape the way children are susceptible to obesity promoting aspects of their dietary environments. Next slide. For instance, in this study, we observed 100 Black children at a dinner meal on 4 different occasions where the portion sizes of foods was systematically increased. And the results showed that total daily energy, or that total energy at the meal consumed by children increased across conditions of increasing portion size. And others had seen this in previous studies. What we also observed is that intakes became more variable as the portion sizes increased, the portion sizes served. And you can see that as the shaded gray bars on the graph. So interestingly, children with higher levels of food responsiveness and those with lower levels of satiety responsiveness showed the greatest increases in energy intake when they were offered larger portion sizes. And these findings were recently corroborated in a longer 5-day study of about similarly aged children in a naturalistic childcare setting by Alyssa Smothers and Barbara Rolls at Penn State. Next slide. So I think the significance for prevention here is that these differences in children's eating behaviors introduce different barriers and opportunities for food parenting. And where added sugar is concerned, the evidence would say that children with higher levels of motivation or drive to eat might require additional supports in place to make positive changes, right? So drawing from a paper that was published by Allison Miller at University of Michigan, I think informing parents about individual differences in children's eating behaviors will actually be helpful. They may reduce feelings of blame and actually help empower parents to implement intervention recommendations. So I think that family-based prevention efforts will only benefit from moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to better take into account children's unique predispositions and needs around eating. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think added sugar poses a clear threat to the health and obesity risk of US children. I think the data are actually remarkably clear. Despite the myriad of influences that make sugar so appealing to children, we have evidence that part of children's orientation to sugar is acquired through experience, and children's intake of added sugars can be modified through intervention. Evidence to date suggests, I think, promise moving forward for family-based approaches that promote authoritative parenting skills that are aligned with parents' aspirations, acknowledge their challenges, those that benefit children's development across multiple domains, and that acknowledge children's unique needs. Next slide. All right. So I wanted to end here with a little bit of fall from Philadelphia this morning. And again, thank you for joining this lecture, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for a great presentation and a very, very important topic and very relevant. And it just, yeah, it was great. And I love your picture here at the end. We do have some questions already in the chat box. So we will start with those. Let me see. One of the first questions is, I would like to know what researchers are doing to work with current food manufacturers and food establishments to change the environment of food available. We all know what to do, but we are addicted to sugar and salt because it's pervasive in foods all around us. And the #1 reason people eat is because of taste, and we've been telling the public to cut back on processed foods and added sugar for years. We need help beyond educating people on what to eat. Is there any hope that food companies change, or has that ship already sailed?
Well, I think those are all phenomenally good points and on spot, right? I will first say that, it's always been a challenge, and it's a delicate balance of working with industry, right? On one hand, food industry, we are all dependent on the food industry. The world is dependent on the food industry to eat, right? And so many think that there should be back and forth, but as we all know, there are a lot of concerns and questions about those partnerships and about bias that might introduce. And so that's, I think, a given, and that's a real challenge that we face. I would say another thing that's important here, though, is the food industry has historically always reacted very quickly to dietary guidelines. So one of my favorite examples, which I always show in my nutrition classes, are boxes of Cinnamon Toast Crunch from a few years ago, and then from whenever they were introduced. And the first boxes that came out said something like, just like, a sweet treat. And the recent boxes say a wonderful source of whole grains, right? So what actually happened when the dietary guidelines were issued is that the food industry rushes to reformulate their products. And so, it's I think it's just a sort of given of where things stand, that there are actions, policy actions that can move that needle. And I think that's important. I also personally think that it is important for scientists to have some level of dialogue and feedback. I think that we have to be very careful about how we move forward. I don't know if I answered, yeah. And so I think your point generally speaks to the fact that there's not going to be one simple intervention, right? And we know that policy level interventions have probably the greatest impact, but are the most difficult to enact. And I think our center hosted Christina Roberto, who is at the University of Pennsylvania last week. And Christina has been, along with Sarah Blake at Harvard University, they've been instrumental in work on evaluating the beverage tax that has gone on in Philly. It's not a sales tax, it's an excise tax. And they found that it's been extremely effective here. And there's a lot of other evidence, but as many of you know who might be following those stories, those taxes have been incredibly difficult to put into place. But I think generally, to answer your question, I think policy is going to be incredibly important going forward, because we know from a behavioral perspective that we have evolved to want sugar, right? We've evolved to hug our kids when they're crying. We've evolved to mate with others, and we've evolved to eat when food is present. So you're right, it's a tremendously challenging needle to move.
So kind of a follow-up question what you just said. There is another question here. I mean, do you have any examples of other policies that could be helpful in addressing this issue, besides the one with the tax, or not the tax?
Sure. I mean, and I think there are probably many on this webinar who are experts in this area. I mean, my area is really of expertise is really limited to behavioral issues in children, but I think policy issues around the nation's food safety net programs are incredibly important. The foods that end up in schools, the foods that are part of supplemental nutrition and assistance program, the foods that are part of the WIC packages, because one of the things that I'm so struck by in a lot of the research on feeding children and a lot of the work in obesity management. And I think to the comment of the first question that we had is that availability is a real driver. And so I think that there are a lot of potentially important areas where policies can have influence on what is available, but also to make progress in making healthier choices easier choices, right? I mean, we have lots of research from behavioral economics that would suggest that there are, it's not simply a matter of what, but it's about the alternatives. And I think there are tremendous opportunities.
Great. Another very relevant question, but on a different topic, kind of. What would you recommend saying to parents who ask about giving their children artificial sweeteners? Since many clients tell us they're giving sugar-free beverages to their young children in an effort to limit sugar intake.
Right. Well, that is a really controversial question and topic. So I'll give you, well, the short answer is, it would be better not to do those things, right? And I'll tell you why. And I think there are two reasons. One is that people have concerns about, okay, let me back up and reformulate my response carefully. I think what we know is that familiarity is really important in terms of what children end up adopting. So in terms of establishing healthy patterns of behavior, what children are exposed to become the basis of how they move forward. And if you think cross-culturally, if you've ever gone to or been exposed to foods that you've never seen before that look crazy, this is how powerful familiarity is. And so I think that, the idea of, from an obesity perspective, right, sugar, there's not really great evidence that non-nutritive sweeteners promote obesity. I mean, I don't think that's at all the case. I think that in fact, among diabetic populations, they're used frequently in terms of weight loss. There are these correlations. The evidence is hard. So do they have impact on children's development? Most of the evidence that we have says that these substances are safe, right? There may be, and as you know, science is always evolving. So there's a lot we don't know. So I think from a behavioral standpoint, the clear answer is, you want to expose children to what you want their diets to look like. And I think that we probably would move away from those things. The last thing I'll say about non-nutritive sweeteners is that from a behavioral standpoint, you have to wonder also if exposure to sweetness primes children to expect sweetness. And so I think this is something that actually there's a lot of conjecture and there are no data. So I don't really know. It's actually a study that we're currently conducting to see whether you can move children's preferences on sweetness. And in our intervention, we absolutely ask mothers for the course of the intervention not to give non-nutritive sweeteners because we suspect that those, and we know from a sensory standpoint that those sweeteners actually act on some taste receptors in a way that's similar to nutritive sweeteners. So I think there are reasons to suspect that even though, okay, I shouldn't use a specific name, but even though a non-nutritive sweetened beverage might not contribute to obesity, they might actually have effects on the way children expect to taste sweetness in beverages, right? So yeah. I think it's a very messy answer because it's actually the evidence to date is very messy at present.
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's a great answer. It's a difficult question. This one is very appropriate right now. So do you have any recent research on how COVID-19 is affecting parental feeding styles and or child snacking?
I don't personally, but I know that Dr. Sharma has done some very good work in this area that was recently published, and she might want to hop on and describe that. And I will say that I do know of others that are actually, in fact, Katie Loth at University of Minnesota, I mentioned some of her data, has collected those data along those lines. And these are very preliminary results that she just shared with me last Friday. In her data, she's seen somewhat of a shift towards both indulgent types of practices, as well as those that support kids' autonomy. And, I think it's really too early to say. I mean, the data that I think are more important is that we know that, there are a lot of kids and a lot of households in this country that are now being affected by food insecurity. And I think that is creating a tremendous stress on our system, and there are a lot of needs that are unmet. I don't know if Dr. Sharma, if you wanted to add something. I read your paper and I thought it's really wonderful, and so I think it's relevant to this question. I don't know if you're...
Sure, just really quickly, because I know there's a lot of people waiting to ask a lot of questions to you, but yeah, I think the work that we looked at was in reference to Brighter Bites, which is a nonprofit that's school-based and provides fresh produce and nutrition education to low-income families. And due to school closures, everything came to a close, and during that time we did a rapid assessment and actually used some epidemiological measures to look at what low-income families with children are talking about their food issues related to COVID and whatnot. And essentially we found that there was, due to financial hardship, due to unemployment concerns and fear of COVID, that food insecurity was greatly exacerbated in the community, and there were concerns just around having their basic needs met. And so I think pivoting of various strategies where we are combining or improving access to healthy food, keeping that going and combining that with health literacy was really needed at that time, and still continues to be, I think, a huge need in our communities. So yeah, that's definitely a great question. I have to ask you one question that a panelist asked, which I think is so right on top of mind for many parents, is sugar rush a thing? And I'll combine that with another question that someone asked, which I think goes well with that question, is if a 5-year-old child has an already established sweet tooth, is there any effective way to reverse it?
Right. Those are great questions. In terms of the first one, the sugar rush, I mean, it's even in my own family, my husband talks about eating pancakes on Saturday, and his head feels crazy. And I think the data, and there have been some carefully designed studies, do not support an effect of sugar on hyperactivity in children. However, this is, and in our studies too, parents often feel that there is a connection, and there's always been some suggestion that maybe there are subpopulations of children who might be more affected. In fact, some of the better controlled studies suggested that maybe there were connections with children who have ADHD. So I think in general the data do not support that idea, but we only know what's been studied. And in terms of the second question, for kids who already have a sweet tooth, what can you do? Well, this is, I think this is most of the US, right? I mean, when we're talking about, making changes, their kids are at, if 6% energy from added sugar is where kids need to be, that's half of where they're at, right? And so, I think we're talking about most kids. And so we go back, what are the most important things you can do for kids who have these predispositions? And I would say from the available literature, the number one thing is to think about what children have available, what's available to children in the home. I mean, I'm definitely believe in moderation. I love the kids' Halloween candy as well, and I don't think it's a all or none sort of scenario, but I do think gradual changes and shifts are possible. I mean, we certainly were, and in fact, the study that we're in the middle of is going to tell us whether we can actually lower that threshold of children's liking for sugar and help move kids to accept foods that are lower in sugar intake. In fact, it's never been studied, so I shouldn't actually give you an answer to it because we don't know if it's possible. But I think from all of the work that's been done on home availability of foods and links to kids' diets, I mean, I think that's where it starts with.
All right, yeah, kind of a follow-up. I mean, it's not even a question, it's more a comment. But so, I mean, I do think different cultures have different taste preferences for sugar, because if you go to Europe, baked goods are not as sweet as they are here. And I know many people that have moved here and they don't even like the baked goods here because they're just too sweet. So it is interesting, right, that a whole different groups of people can have maybe different thresholds of what they like in terms of sweetness.
And I think that also goes back to the previous question, though, and comment about the incredibly fundamentally important role of familiarity and exposure, right? Because that's the basis. I mean, to date, there's no evidence that our genes make cultural groups, you know, have different levels of preferences for various things. I mean, I think Paul Rosen said, if you need to know one thing about someone's eating habits, ask about culture, right? Because culture is so fundamental to who we are. And we know that there's huge cultural variability in many things about eating, from who is at the table, when eating occurs, how eating occurs, what foods are available. And all of those things are socially acquired through experience and through familiarity.
Yeah. And what do you, okay, hold on, sorry. I have my own questions, but I need to go to the questions that are here. I like this one. I have clients that think offering 100% juice to the children is healthy because of the advertisement towards 100% juice. What do you suggest telling the clients? Although it does not have any added sugars, it does lack the vitamins and fiber that whole fruits contains. So I guess, how do you feel about 100% juice versus sugar-sweetened beverages? I know.
That's a good question, right? That's another one that gets things stirred up very quickly, right? Because, for instance, the WIC program has historically included juice, right? And yet at the same time, the American Academy of Pediatrics has specifically put limits on juice consumption, or recommended limits on juice consumption in children. And another layer of controversy around juice is that while the sugars are natural, there's some evidence, it's not strong evidence, that liquid calories are more easily consumed and they're less well regulated than calories from solid foods, and so there's that added level of concern. I mean, I would say that in all of the obesity kind of risk literature, if you have to pick one thing that you ingest and say this, if you ingest this, you're at greater risk, it's sugar-sweetened beverages, right? They're fluids. That has, and there are probably lots of reasons for that, but I think that it's, as a nutritionist, is juice better than soda? Yes, it's great. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Although but again, I would say, how often is it given? And that's probably the most important thing, right? And what is the balance with other beverages? Because again, one of the things within families, within schools, within the context that children eat, what they encounter every day sort of helps them understand what's normal and what they expect. And it's same in all of our households, right? And so I think that's the real issue. We know that there are links between juices and dental health. We know that kids can overconsume juices and be given juices too frequently. So those are definitely the concerns.
Great, thank you. There's several questions about schools and school lunches. And given the fact that students eat so much of their, or get such a high percentage of their calories from school, how can, let's see, I'm reading one of the questions. How can one encourage variety and increase dietary nutrients while eating with peers during school lunches? Let me see, that's.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, it's quite a bit out of my area of expertise, again, because I'm mostly focused on family level influences. But again, from a policy level, the policies that school have around what's in the cafeteria, right? So not only the school foods, but what used to be called competitive foods. I think they're now, known a little bit differently, are incredibly important, right? And, and so in terms of variety around peers, there's been social marketing, there've been all sorts of number of things that are important, but I think, again, policy level efforts are going to be main drivers where we're talking about what's happening in school is concerned. And those include things like whether kids can go off campus for lunch, whether they stay at school lunch, what the stigmas are around consuming school lunch or breakfast looks like. And I think all of those things are important and movable. And as many of you know, it's not really only about school meals, but the broader policies around nutrition at the school. And many schools have invested a lot of effort nationally over the past number of years in developing policies, not only for foods like at breakfasts or lunches, but the larger context of availability, whether fundraisers are used, whether on and on. So I think there's a lot of opportunity at the school levels to impact kids' nutrition, and kids are spending a lot of time at school, right? So even though my interest is in family, I mean, I think the research is very clear that as children grow, that other influences become more important. And in many ways, this is great from a policy level. It's easier, well, I don't know if it's easier to intervene with schools, but there's a huge opportunity, I think, there to have effect at a population level.
Yeah, great, thank you. We are running out of time, so I have one last question that is going to be very easy, yes or no. So somebody asked if the Food, Fun, and Families curriculum is available. Well,
that's a great question. So this was it was a study that was funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, AFRI Association, and their goal in funding this study was actually to launch it out into to SNAP Ed, to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program educational arm. And so my colleague Elena Serrano at Virginia Tech we've adapted this 12-week intensive kind of program to be delivered in a shorter 6-week bundle by peer educators. And so I think the intent is to make the program widely available. And I would be, I don't know if you can provide my contact information, but I'm happy to help anyone who's interested in that program have access to it.
Great. Yeah, that was, I think, a great question to end on. And just want to say thank you again so much for taking the time to talk to us and be willing to answer lots of questions. There's actually a lot more questions on here, so I think that's great. But thank you, and thank all of y'all who attended this webinar and this lectureship, and we hope to see you again soon. And just remember that the presentation has been recorded, and so will be available on our website in a few days. And I guess I just want to end by saying I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.